go up a little bit more. And appreciate the University of Graz and their willingness to host me. And I'm looking forward to talking to you more today. I'm going to be talking to you today about how we might think about addressing intractable conflict through interactive methods. And you'll notice I have interactive highlighted. And so I'm going to be making a case a bit for why interaction between the parties is critical in how we do this kind of work. So let me start by showing you some of the areas I want to talk about today. So are we streaming okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I am going to move fairly rapidly through most of these areas to put the topics out there, and then given our time frame, we'll see which areas you'd like to come back to and talk the most about, maybe ask questions, maybe discuss more, okay? So first I want to lay out a little bit about the context of intractable conflict and its characteristics and what makes it so challenging sometimes to intervene into these types of conflicts. And then we're going to look a little bit more at the kinds of forms that are of change that are needed in intractable conflicts. I will then talk to you a little bit more about this particular approach that has already been mentioned of interactive problem solving. And then finally, if we have time, I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the additional more current thinking and research that's going on related to this area, okay? So I think it's relevant to talk about the area of intractable conflict as a start, because that is partly how I met your two professors. We were all at a conference, actually Dr. Herzl as well, at a conference that had to do with intractable conflict and these kinds of approaches. And so that was my introduction to several of your professors, and I was fortunate to be able to talk to them more during those conferences. They also were interested in this form of intervention known as interactive problem solving. And so if we want to talk a little bit more about the nature of intractable conflict, first I'll just back up. I'm assuming that you all are primarily in the faculty of law, politics, and global governance, right? And so I'm going to speak to you a little bit from what I'm assuming is some of your knowledge base around conflict, right? So before we talk specifically about intractable conflict, if I move away from the mic, do I have to stand here? Do I need to stand here? Okay. I'm one of these people that likes to move when I'm talking, right? So let's back up first and talk a little bit about the nature of conflict itself before we talk more specifically about intractable conflict. Okay? So one definition, coming more from a social psychological or psychological perspective on conflict, suggests that conflict is a perceived divergence of interest, a belief that parties' current aspirations are incompatible. So coming from, again, from the perspective of that this has to do with how you look at things, right? And then another definition of conflict might be one that's more of a structural definition. This is Lawrence Kozer. It's a struggle over values and claims to scarce status, power, and resources, in which the aims of the opponents are to neutralize, injure, or eliminate their rivals. So we have both of these perspectives on defining conflict. One of the ones, though, that I find to be quite important for the kinds of conversations we're going to be having today has to do with conflict as a perception that you're both interdependent with the other party, but that your goals are negatively correlated. In other words, what that is kind of a fancy way of saying that if you're trying to achieve your goals and increase those, that those by necessity decrease the ability for the other party to obtain their goals, right? Another way to think about this is the notion of zero sum. Those of you that come from economics may have encountered this way of framing that notion. In game theory and economic theory, a zero-sum game is a mathematical representation of a situation in which basically a gain for one is a loss for the other. So if you're perceiving of a situation as one where the only way you can achieve what you want to achieve is by preventing the other party from achieving their goals, you have this notion of a zero sum. And that by nature, that then develops a competitive dynamic where you, again, are obviously trying to achieve your goals and prevent the other from achieving theirs. We get into these nice spiral models where we can think about the dynamics of a competitive cycle and how, as each party attempts to reach its goals, it makes the other party also strive to do the same, right? You might have an increase in tactics, change in methods. In fact, Pruitt and Kim, and again, I'm rushing through these a little bit quickly. If there are any of these that you want to come back and talk about more, we can do that later. Pruitt and Kim, originally Pruitt, Rubin, and Kim, developed these characterizations of how a conflict actually escalates and the kinds of changes that happen, right? And in this case, some of the things that they identify happen in conflict cycles is that tactics change, they get heavier, the number of issues enlarges, the nature of those issues changes. It moves from specific issues to much more general issues that frankly then become harder to address when you move to de-escalate or solve those conflicts. The motivation of the parties change from achieving your goals to actually being the one to triumph, again, that zero-sum aspect, to then potentially even moving into the destructive escalation of that the only thing that matters is taking the other party down, even though it hurts you as well. And then also the number of parties will increase. Some of the other challenges in conflict include, and again, these are in a sense general conflicts. We're not yet talking about intractable interethnic conflicts. I'm talking about any conflicts, the conflicts that you might deal with as lawyers, right? You have these kinds of escalation dynamics. A couple of other difficult challenges presenting themselves in the negotiation of conflicts are these perspective or perceptual issues that have to do with legitimacy and trust, right? So legitimacy refers to a party's acceptance and recognition that an opponent's issues or interests, and even an opponent's emotions are genuine, reasonable, and conform to recognized principles. Without a perception of legitimacy, negotiations may never begin. Another issue, critical, trust, usually has to do with a person's capacity to depend on or place confidence in the truthfulness or accuracy of another's statements or behaviors. Trust grows out of interaction, and it grows out of experiences, and that's the only way you can actually change the perceptions of trust. I'll just add that it is through interaction that you actually generate mistrust and doubt as well, which is why, again, we're returning to this focus on interaction is key. So the dynamics I've talked about so far, again, we can go into these more in detail later if you like, but these are dynamics of most conflicts. Now I'm going to move into another realm that we would call more intractable conflicts. These are conflicts that you'll notice I've framed it as potentially unmediatable. With mediated negotiations, you would move to working with the parties to understand their underlying interests and craft some sort of integrative negotiated solution. There are a whole class of conflicts, however, where dealing with them on the level of interests will not ultimately resolve the conflict, right? You may actually achieve some sort of negotiated settlement, but these will reoccur and happen, in a sense, they keep recurring, right? Across years and across generations. I have a couple of examples up here. One is in my own country that reflects some of the ideological differences. This is actually in Charlottesville, Virginia, when there was a protest between, on the one side, the Black Lives Matter movement, and on the other side, those that were more supportive of some of the very conservative, almost fascist aspects of the US, right? And on the right, this is actually a recent photo. Does anybody know what that one is? Have you been following the dynamics in Ethiopia lately? So this is the conflict between the government in Ethiopia and the Tigrayan faction, which at different points in history, governance in Ethiopia has oscillated between these different factions. And each time when one faction is in control, it frames the governance as a zero-sum game, right? That we're in control, you're not in control. And each time governance flips, you have the same dynamic in reverse. So you have a repetition of this exclusionary dynamic. So what is the nature of conflict in deeply divided societies? Some of these, again, I'll go through fairly rapidly, but just so that we can understand the kind of challenges that we're dealing with and why they're so pernicious and difficult to resolve. So we have inequalities in these societies that anyone would document and could say exist, but in addition to those inequalities existing, people perceive those inequalities as unjust, right? There are many societies where you have inequalities that are somehow justified or rationalized. It's when those inequalities are seen as unjust that leads to conflict. Existing institutions lack universally perceived legitimacy for resolving conflicts and addressing grievances. Are there institutions in the society that are perceived as having legitimacy for actually handling the conflicts that emerge in a society? This is where the rule of law is very important. If there's no perceived mechanisms where all of the parties give that mechanism legitimacy, then any of the solutions that come out will be questioned, right? Or seen as biased. Cohesion and identity form around narrower lines than defined by states. And people assert their grievances through groups, through group identities. It's partly because those inequalities are also tied to those group identities. You oftentimes have a breakdown of centralized authority. There is this history of antagonism across generations, oftentimes, that is accompanied by stereotypes and expectations that end up being filters through which any kind of information is run, right? And those intergroup differences are also associated with a history of violence. Depolarization and sharp divisions are functional for increasing cohesion, reducing ambiguity, and decreasing the internal criticisms of leaders. So this is not going to surprise you, but these dynamics, these polarizing dynamics, are actually functional for leaders that want to take advantage of them, right? Conflicts are both internal and internationalized. Oftentimes these conflicts are, in these kinds of societies, the conflict is between groups within the society, so that's where they're internal. But because you oftentimes generate refugee flows across borders, you have alliances, you have resource flows across borders, so it in a sense spills out beyond that particular state. And formal and governmental mechanisms for dealing with these conflicts are limited. So in case you're curious and want to read more about this particular outline is from John Paul Lederach. I say that because now I'm just going to bring up a couple of points from Ed Azar, who also talks a little bit about what he would call protracted social conflicts, again, similar to the intractable term. Hostile interactions which extend over long periods of time with sporadic outbreaks of open warfare fluctuating in frequency and intensity. We have periods where there's open warfare, open violence, and then we have periods where sometimes it reverts to a status that we might call a frozen conflict. I don't know if people are familiar with that term. Nagorno-Karabakh is a good example of that recently, where we've had outbreaks of violence, then we've had periods where it's really been just kind of a stasis. It hasn't been resolved, it's not peace, and it's not war, right? And then again, obviously about a year ago, we had open violence, again, emerged there. You also have, again, these structural inequalities and political power differences, and those result in differential distribution of rewards that are connected to group membership, and that's really key. Domination, discrimination, and victimization are linked also to group identity, and we have these dynamics that are negative and escalatory. The real source of conflict is the denial of these human needs that are common to all and whose pursuit is an ontological drive in all, especially security, distinctive identity, social recognition of identity, and effective participation in processes that determine the conditions of security and identity. So this comes from Edward Azar, but it also goes a little bit farther back to John Burton, who also examined international relations, came from a diplomatic background himself, and considered that the way that international diplomacy was being conducted was not adequately addressing these kinds of basic human needs. And he and some of these others are part of who helped to develop this alternative approach, if you will, to diplomacy that we would call interactive problem solving. So we have these challenges of intractable conflict. We have structural differences that are tied to identity. We have those identities linked to stereotypes and distortion, if you will, of, or in fact, inability to connect to the other side. The communication channels have been ruptured, and we, in a sense, have a self-reinforcing system, right? So how do we address that? So Richard Solomon at one point said, sustainable peace requires that longtime antagonists not merely lay down their arms, but that they achieve profound reconciliation that will endure because it is sustained by a network of relationships and mechanisms that promote justice and address the root causes of enmity before they can regenerate destabilizing tensions. Within his statement, we have some of the key pieces that we're going to be looking at, right? A network of relationships, mechanisms that promote justice, and some way to address the root causes of these enmity that has to do with the structural inequalities. Now, you may have read about some of these folks in your work. Johan Galtung is sometimes considered to be one of the fathers and mothers of peace research, and he had early on proposed a distinction between direct structural and cultural violence and negative peace and positive peace. I'll go over those a little bit, but it's actually interesting to note that subsequently, when Kofi Annan put forth his agenda for peace, those concepts within that were based on Galtung, right? So Galtung talked about how, in addition to direct violence, which is in a sense very salient, right? You have structural violence when you have these kinds of inequalities that, in a sense, structurally promote and maintain injustice. Denial of basic security, identity, participation in the conditions that allow you to encourage those. Cultural violence is when those kinds of structural inequalities are considered normal, are considered acceptable, right? And then again, we have this other notion of negative peace versus positive peace, where negative peace is that absence of violence. Let's stop the fighting. And Galtung is saying we need to go beyond just stopping the violence to changing the conditions that have produced the need for violence, which is the positive peace side of it. Now, you may be wondering, I'm going a little off script here, you may be wondering, what does that include? Does that include development? Does that include economic development? Does that include, what all do we want to put within the bucket of positive peace? And if you're thinking that, you're not alone. That actually is a debate within the peace building field right now, right? How far out does that circle go? Is making sure that you have water for everyone, is that peace building? Depends on your definition, right? And so even within the UN, there's a debate about how much is actually peace building. So Herbert Kellman, who you heard mentioned already, also added to this notion of peace building in pointing out that conflict is actually much more than just these kinds of intractable conflicts are much more than just interstate conflicts, intergovernmental, that they actually have filtered down through the societies. And in some of that's intentional, right? I mean, in a sense, the leadership has mobilized their populations by having them filtered down through the societies, but it also comes up from below. And these are those places where these conflicts have endured over generations and have continued to fester. And so what he would be arguing is that any intervention would need to be not just interstate or intergovernmental, but intersocietal, right? And then we have another group of others, often coming from diplomacy background, who are arguing for the importance of going beyond state-based diplomacy to including the rebuilding of relationships across groups. This is a diagram on peace building coming from John Paul Lederach, who basically is proposing that it needs to happen, peace building needs to happen at multiple levels. I think we heard that in the introduction a bit, that Professor Ehrman was saying that it needs to be multiple levels, right? Lederach basically argued that you not only need to work at the top elite level, but that you also have the grassroots leadership, and that you also have this in-between level of what some would call influentials that are able to both influence the elites and are in touch with the grassroots, and that they can provide an important bridging function in an approach to peace building. And you need to do it at all of these levels, right? I won't go into details here, but there's been some different conversations about these different approaches to diplomacy as different forms of diplomacy. But where I want to come to next is how we get these forms of change that are needed. In thinking about human behavior and how people change what they do, people need to both have a motivation to change and a sense of where to go to change. And that can be whether we're talking about peace building or we're talking about stopping smoking, or, I mean, whatever kind of change, getting people to wear masks, whatever kind of change it is, people have to both have a motivation and they have to have a path forward, right? If you have motivation but no obvious direction forward, it can just either result in inertia or even anxiety. And on the other hand, if you have the path, but you don't have the sense that there's in a sense, a momentum to go forward, you also are not going to be engaged. Pruitt, I have his name here, was a person that proposed, if you're familiar with the ripeness theory in international relations of Zartman, who talked about how states have to be ripe to settle. Pruitt added to that and said that it's not enough to, in a sense, have those, in a sense, your priorities realigned, which is, in a sense, what Zartman and others would argue, but that you would have to see someone on the other side. He would call it optimism. There has to be a sense that there's a party on the other side with whom you can go forward. That there's both a potential common ground with that party, and that party has the ability, if you will, to deliver, has the ability to negotiate on behalf of their party. Here's my little graphic about changing. So these are, in my framing, 3 types of change that are needed to address intractable conflict. You have the need to address the perceptions and the relations that have prevented the parties even from being willing to engage at the negotiating table. You also then, that's the perceptions and relations. You also need to have a path forward. You need to have process, aspects of the process that produce some sort of new options. So you're both changing motivation and you're changing perceptions of options, right? And then finally, it's not enough to just settle the immediate conflict or presenting disputes. There has to be some attempt to address the underlying structural conditions that have produced the ongoing conflict and keep it going. And so what we see are tasks: changing attitudes, perceptions, and relationships, changing the willingness to engage with the partner. And I will suggest that there are actually several processes out there that can work on these issues. You may be familiar with contact theory or contact experiences, where you bring parties together under the right conditions and have them engage with each other, primarily to change relationships, to change attitudes, actually to also change certain kinds of intergroup behaviors, right? Dialogue is another format for intergroup learning. Some of you may have participated in dialogues. And then IPS, that's my abbreviation for interactive problem solving. It's another, again, method that can do that piece. With jointly developing solutions to the problem, again, the actual options for how to go forward, we have integrative negotiations. We have mediated negotiations. Interactive problem solving can also contribute to ideas and options for going forward. And then finally, we have this piece about changing the structures that actually gives parties the hope that this is sustainable and we can change the larger driving forces, right? And here, this is particularly where I think your cluster has some things to contribute in thinking, and so I have interactive problem solving as well, but I would be interested in engaging with you in thinking about how the things that you all study within law, policy, and governance can work on this piece, right? Okay, so how are we doing? So far? Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about interactive problem solving. So this is not necessarily an interactive problem solving workshop, but they look a lot like this, right? You have a bunch of people sitting around a table, taking notes, writing things down.
It's nothing, just do it.
Okay. Okay. I actually was giving a lecture in New Zealand, and something like this happened, but much louder. And they actually had to stop the whole lecture. And I mean, it was like some sort of thing happening on campus for emergencies. And so I'm a little bit aware of these things. So interactive problem solving, we can have it, one definition of it might be off the record, face-to-face meetings between members of adversarial groups where a third party facilitates participants working through a structured agenda, I'm going to tell you more about, that asks participants to consider the concerns of all parties participating, the shape of possible solutions, and the constraints faced by all parties participating to accepting those various possible solutions. It does have a focus on what we talked about earlier, not only addressing what we might call the surface issues or interests, but trying to understand those underlying basic human needs that may be denied, that are continuing the conflict over generations, right? These workshops are typically confidential, and that, not typically, they are confidential. And the reason that they're confidential, there's a few reasons for that. One is that there's plenty of research out there that shows that confidential conversations allow for people to learn more, right? And it allows for people to be more creative because they're not having on-the-record public discussions. It also, because they're off the record, allows for certain participants to actually come, if you will, because if there are participants that are influential enough that if it were known that they were engaging with their counterparts on the other side, they would be, at a minimum, critiqued, and sometimes actually in physical danger. So having confidential conversations allows them that kind of cover, and we can talk more about how that's done. And again, they're often done with influentials in that middle level of that triangle to maximize the impact so that it both moves up to the elites and it moves down to the grassroots. Again, once again, not an actual picture because we don't take photos, but some of the things that we try to do in an interactive problem-solving workshop: change individual perceptions and group policies, change those relationships. Remember, we talking about the importance of the challenge of building trust and ensuring a perception of legitimacy of the other, right? That's one of the things that can be worked on. Another dimension of this is helping the parties to recognize conflict dynamics, changing an understanding of options and their probabilities, changing a sense of possibility, motivation, and of partner. This is that optimism aspect. And then sometimes actually using them to create tangible outputs. Sometimes actual memoranda may come out of these types of workshops. And these are meant to contribute to negotiations, specific ideas, but also to create networks, to create cadres of those who have, in a sense, both had training in thinking about the analytic side of conflict, but also experience in engaging with people from the other party, which is itself a valuable aspect. And finally, we're hoping, in a sense, to transform that conflict system. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about some of the specifics of, am I going to tell you about that? I'll do it really briefly. And then if we have other questions, I can come back to this in more detail. So within an interactive problem-solving workshop, maybe I'll back up instead of starting with communication and topic and start with participants. So you would first want to seek participants who met this definition of influential, right? Who is it that would be able to come and both bring the insights that are available to them from their position and also would ultimately be able to transfer new insights into the larger debate, the larger policy-making process, okay? So in a sense, there are two primary tracks of change, or I guess we could put it that way as well: education and transfer out, right? So you want people to change how they're thinking as a result of being in the workshop, thinking about options, thinking about prioritization of options, thinking about the other, thinking about their ability to trust the other, all those kinds of things, right? But you also want it to be able to go outside of the room. If it only stays in the room, if it only stays with those people, it's going to be a very slow change process, right? So part of the theory of change, if you will, undergirding this approach, that may be a term people are familiar with in terms of intervention, talking about an intervention theory of change. The theory of change behind this is that by changing the knowledge and the relationships of certain influentials, it will be more likely to transfer more quickly into the larger conversation, both in the society, public opinion, et cetera, and also to those elites. So some of the people that you might bring in to strategically do that would be things like party leaders, journalists, other kinds of thought leaders, academics, advisors to official politicians, right? Sometimes it might actually be relatives of official politicians, and it ends up coming in the side door, right? Ways of having that information. Those are people that are both able to bring important information into the room, but the crucible that then is created that then will generate new ideas is, in a sense, more connected to the actual pressing realities, and you have more of a sense that then it will transfer out. So that's why those participants are actually chosen in a strategic way. In terms of the topic in communication, it's typically an analysis of the conflict, okay? You're trying to, it's facilitated by a third party, but the third party is trying to slow down the process and work them through an agenda that's actually intentionally structured to look at certain things, right? If you just bring conflict parties together, what happens? Right. They speak for the record. They speak to speak, but not to listen, right? They're not listening to each other, right? So you actually have to change the norms of the forum to get people to think differently and act differently, right? And so part of doing that is also setting up ground rules or guidelines. If any of you do mediation, you probably are familiar with doing that kind of thing at an interpersonal level, right? And that then allows for a kind of learning and reassessment that is, again, intentional. You want to have it in a setting that allows for these kinds of new norms, for norms of analysis to take place. In terms of the third-party role, the third-party role is both a facilitative role, sets up the forum, actually, in a sense, chairs the interaction, very much of a hands-off approach, but ultimately around encouraging the parties themselves to analyze together their conflict and to generate new options. And then the timing, I put that on here because we can talk more about these details if you're interested, but people have sometimes asked, when do you use this kind of approach? It originally probably was developed more in a pre-negotiation stage for situations where negotiations were stuck or they couldn't even get parties to the table, because to engage with the other side oftentimes would legitimize a party that officially was not, they didn't want to legitimize, right? Or because they did not perceive that there was anything constructive that would come out of engaging with the other. That's where those perceptions and stereotypes operate, keep people separate, right? Bringing people together in a pre-negotiation setting. But it has been shown that these are useful in a para-negotiation phase. When negotiations are going on, they can deal with some of the tougher issues. So when the Madrid negotiations were going on, for example, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there were side conversations that were going on in interactive problem solving that were dealing with some of the more difficult issues. And then as a post-negotiation support for implementation. One of the things that, skipping ahead to the last piece that I'm just going to mention a little bit about, is people are starting to ask, is there a usefulness for using this kind of an approach in a reconciliation phase, which we would typically put more towards the post-conflict phase. And that's still an open question. And again, it's a strategic approach. So, here we are. So let me then go ahead and just in a couple words let you know a few of the things that I'm working on now. Again, most of the writing and the work on this has looked at it as a method to look at relationships, negotiation options, and potentially changing the structural conditions, right? This is a diagram from someone named Ari Nadler, who has talked about how in addition, when you get to the reconciliation phase, you need to not just have structural change, you need to not just be building relationships, but that they're ultimately, for enduring sustainable reconciliation, need to be changes in the parties' identities themselves. And so how do you do that, right? And so there's been some interesting work on how to do that. And I'm just going to throw up a couple last things and we can come back to these. One thing about identities that Kalman actually reflected on is that in addition to most issues being seen as zero-sum, one of the things that he asserted, and in a sense almost empirically derived from many experiences, is that parties perceive their identities are zero-sum. For your identity to exist, for your identity to be validated, somehow invalidates my identity. Now you can see how that dynamic would make a conflict very hard to resolve, right? And so he would argue that one task is also to address that aspect of identity. So Nadler looks at identity threats, and he would argue that in addition to those basic human needs, identity, security, participation in political processes, that type of thing, he would argue that in conflicts, perpetrators and victims have different needs as well. That at the end of or when the dust settles, in a sense, the victims have gone through a period where they have experienced a lack of control and a kind of existential delegitimization. And so one of the essential needs is for victims to have agency and control again and be validated, right? On the perpetrator side, there's a sense that there's been a moral injury to an injury to the moral identity, and that perpetrators are concerned or would even fear being excluded from a larger community that was important to them. And so the need of the perpetrators is to be reintegrated into that community, to be recognized as being valid and part of that community. And so Nadler asserts that there's a kind of interesting interactive cycle between what victims and perpetrators can do. Oftentimes victims, as a way to regain control, want vengeance, right? Oftentimes perpetrators, as a way to kind of reduce that sense of injury to their moral selves, will disengage. They will actually dehumanize the victim, or say that this, in a sense, this was not what it seems, right? He would argue that there is a way to actually constructively, again, through interaction, counter that cycle. That the victim group can accept, well, we start with the perpetrator side. The perpetrator side apologizes. The victim can either forgive or not forgive. And that power and control of either having forgiveness to grant or not restores their sense of control. And when they do forgive, then the perpetrator is, in a sense, allowed back into the community, if you will. Now, obviously, that probably feels like a little bit of an oversimplification to you. I mean, it's a model, right? And one of the challenging pieces of it is that in most intractable conflicts, you don't have a simple victim and a simple perpetrator. Both sides are both in many of these conflicts. So therein you have a little bit of a paradox and a dilemma. Each side thinks that they're the victim and is waiting for the other side to start the process, right? We can talk more about that. And then finally, Ria Shibata at University of Otago has looked in particular at, she was looking in particular at reluctance of Japanese to accept responsibility for what World War II injuries in China. So Nanjing Massacre, Comfort Women, not China, sorry, actually both, South Korea and China. And what she found was that her Japanese participants, if she looked at those that were the most willing to re-engage or reconcile and those that were the least willing, what she found was that the pattern reflected whether or not the acknowledgement fit with a moral identity that they had. So if they, on the one hand, felt that acknowledging would reduce their Japanese identity, they were reluctant to engage. There were those on the other side, though, who felt that acknowledging what the Japanese had done would actually reinforce their moral identity. And they were more likely then to support engagement. And so, again, each of these dynamics we can talk about as potentially ways to think about, in an interactive setting, how you might be able to move the parties toward some sort of reconciliation. So I am just going to end it there and say again, these are the areas that we've chatted about. The nature of intractable conflict, the different forms of change as a result that are needed, this particular method of interactive problem solving, and then finally, some of this newer work looking at the additional role of identity change. So I'll stop there and we can answer questions. Did I go too fast? Please.
And thanks for your presentation. I'm Yura, and I'm mostly research Southeastern Europe. So my questions will come from basically the ex-Yugoslav space. One question is about the injustice or the unjustness of injustice and the perception of an injustice being as unjust. I wanted to ask whether it matters by whom this injustice is perceived. Namely, if it's only perceived by, let's say, the minority or the marginalized group, does it actually lead to a long-term conflict? If the majority or the group that's mostly doing the marginalization doesn't perceive it as well, or at least try in some ways to respond, whether with violence or perhaps even by answering it. So the power of the
Interesting question.
The beholder, how would you
Right, interesting question. So let me see if I can repeat it just to make sure that I'm getting it. So that if you have different perceptions of whether or not there is an injustice, if you have a case where only the minority group perceives it as unjust and the majority group does not perceive it as unjust, do you have conflict?
Yeah, long term.
What do you think? Do you have conflict?
I think conflict, but not a long-term one, maybe,
Okay.
or maybe not one that challenges the state in a meaningful way. And most conflict, I would say, maybe does challenge the state in a more integrated way. But I'm just
so if we were to go back to some of these definitions around conflict, right? If part of what drives protracted social conflicts forward is the neglect of basic human needs like identity, security, and participation, right? If you feel that your ability to be in the society and have your identity protected, have security, and have participation in setting up the conditions that will preserve your identity and security, if those are compromised, then you have the recipe for conflict, for ongoing conflict. And so if you're asking about after a particular period of time where certain injuries have happened, if a subgroup still feels that those are compromised, then you will still have conflict. It doesn't matter what the majority group feels, in a sense, right? And so one of the challenges, if you will, coming from perhaps the law and policy side, is how do you set up remedies so that those minority groups don't feel this is going to happen again, right? And you all can teach me more about that, because that's your area, right? But it would suggest that unless those conditions are met, you will continue to have conflict. As long as, I mean, at a very much basic level, conflict is in the eye of the beholder, right? Injustice, yeah. What else? Good question. Follow up?
I actually had a second one.
Yeah.
And that's because in the triangle you mentioned structural, recognizing structural violence long term.
Yeah.
And this, because now, for example, in the, again, post-Yugoslav space, there's a lot of research looking at historical inequalities and discrimination. But then there's an issue. Does it matter, does intent matter, do you think, in terms of defining? So if the intent wasn't to, let's say, discriminate group B, but the policies did discriminate group B, but let's say you called group B group green,
Right.
does it matter when you look back and kind of try to trace structural discrimination
Yeah.
long term, does intent matter or not? Because I would argue it does, but then I've been countered with arguments that it does not if it was perceived by the perpetrator as a different category.
Interesting, interesting.
Sorry.
So I'm guessing, so if group green or group B perceives that group green is greenwashing, then does it matter, right? I mean, if it's a beautiful example, right? There are so many examples of this kind of thing where it's like, as long as we write it this way, no one will notice, but everyone knows, maybe not everyone, but all it takes is the ability to project intent, right? Even if that intent wasn't there on the part of some people, right? If the group that's being discriminated against has the ability to project intent, then it will be a motivation for continuing the conflict. And until they have, going back to in a sense, the core of this conversation, until they have the interaction with the other party that de-escalates those reinforcing stereotypes, they will still have that perception of intent, right? And so, I mean, in a sense, that is partly how you can use these kinds of approaches to counter that. But again, you don't want to greenwash. Is that a term here? Yeah, okay. So you don't want to greenwash it, right? You don't want to pretend that you're actually improving it when you're not improving it. Yeah. What else?
Yeah, there's been some criticism for, let's say, now for about 20 years towards this can-do attitude of problem-solving approaches within peace building, with the argument that the problem-solving approaches cannot really meet the high expectation in practice. And some of the arguments are even pointing towards it might even sometimes be better to try to not solve a problem than to solve it, with the outcome being maybe better than trying to solve the problem. What would you say? Is it always better to try to solve the problem with the high goal of positive peace on the horizon, or could it maybe be misleading sometimes? Speaking of Oslo, maybe.
Yeah, well, and there's different versions of the argument that you're making, that, you know, that sometimes by bringing parties together, you are in a sense neutralizing their motivation to push from a more aggressive stance, right? Are you co-opting the certain aspects of the movement and neutralizing them or making them less? I mean, this argument is sometimes made within the U.S. around U.S. race relations, and if we have dialogues that bring blacks and whites together, are we just, the jet lag, it makes the words not come as much, diluting the energy that would actually push towards the structural change, right? And that's, I think, a legitimate argument. However, going back to one of the points I made earlier, if you have the motivation, you have the energy, but you don't have the path, then it doesn't necessarily solve things either. And in fact, it builds things up, right? So you have to have, you don't want to dilute the motivation for change by having people feel warm and fuzzy towards each other when there's structural injustices going on, right? On the other hand, you want to have enough of the cross-group communication channels, influence channels, option-generating crucibles, so that even though the motivation is pushing from this side, this over here can create a path forward. Does that answer the question? Okay. Yeah.
I have a question. Since you mentioned also deeply divided places, my mom to the settlement of civil conflicts through power sharing agreements, like for example the tariff agreement, the Dayton agreement. And do you consider this kind of solution a sustainable solution in the long term, or more a recipe for further conflict, as it happened, for example, now in Lebanon?
Okay, did I hear you say Dayton?
No.
Oh, okay.
I say Dayton. Yes. I also mentioned Dayton agreement now.
The Dayton Accords. Okay. Okay.
Dayton and also tariff agreement.
And the tariff agreements.
More or
Okay.
less similar.
So that's an interesting question. In both cases, I'm less familiar with the Taif Accords, but the Dayton Accords really were not addressing these underlying issues, right? And in fact, I mean, they may have, if you look at some of the outputs of those accords that in a sense reinforced the separation between the ethnic groups rather than integrating them, right? I mean, it did not allow for the kind of interaction that would ultimately counter the normal conflict dynamic, right? And so you may have attempted, I mean, that's actually a very interesting question. So you may have, in a sense, addressed the structural issues by having power sharing, but you haven't addressed the other dimensions.
The identity problem, basically.
Yeah.
Because you, in my opinion, you enforce the identity, so you still have an identity problem.
Right.
And you will never have integration. It's actually, for me, it would be even more difficult to have interaction in the long term than in the beginning, because you basically enforce identity. So maybe a follow-up question could be, how can you deconstruct this power sharing agreement starting from the grassroots level?
Very interesting. Well, and again, this is more your area than my area, but you would have to have, wouldn't you have to have, I mean, if we assume that interaction is critical, how could you develop structures, power sharing structures that would, it's a really interesting question, that would reinforce the necessity of interaction in order for parties to be able to accomplish what they need to accomplish, and actually true interaction, right? Because, I mean, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they have to interact, right? They all have to get their things signed to be able to get, I mean, they still have to do things together, but not really, right? And so, I don't know. I think that's a brilliant area that needs to be further developed. How you build in those kinds of interactions, right? So that you want to have interdependence. Remember we talked about interdependence. Interdependence can either be perceived as a negative interdependence or it can be a positive interdependence, right? And so if you structure the setting so that it's a positively interdependent, my goals are only achieved if your goals are achieved, and vice versa, rather than the opposite, where my goals are only achieved if yours are not achieved, right? So structuring that in, yeah. So I hope that's your project going forward.
That's my project.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Another question coming from this a bit more critical area towards problem solving also relates to how you make sure to find people representing, for example, grassroots. Also, when you set up those workshops, mostly it's people coming from the external, who mostly interact with urban middle class people who have more or less converging interests with those people, who the externals then consider grassroots, while they would actually not be grassroots, while the actual grassroots would be far away from the scope of the internationals. Are there approaches to make sure that you can find someone, or are there approaches that provide a little bit more space so that something like that can
Yeah.
grow and that you can grasp it also from the outside?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is an important criticism, right? And in fact, this is one of the criticisms that was leveled at the process in Cyprus, is that even though there was a surprising amount of support among the Turkish Cypriot side for the solution, that there wasn't adequate support on the Greek Cypriot side, and that part of it was because it had mainly concentrated on the elite level, right? So one of the things I think it's important to recognize is that interactive problem solving as a method, in a sense of what you facilitate and how you create change, can be, in a sense, separated out from any particular context and any level. I mean, it's true that I talked about it at that kind of middle level of a society, but you can use these kinds of layers at any level, right? So you could look at the city of Graz and say, okay, how do we change something, right? And think about how you get influence up and influence down. And so you could use grassroots leaders and still have that same logic, still that same strategy. I mean, the strategy is recognizing that there's a trade-off between involving a lot of people and involving key people. And in fact, there are some people that have written about, Mary Anderson and others have written about that in a sense you need to do both, right? You want to have, in a certain prong of peace building, you need to have more people involved, but to have certain change that happens more quickly, you need to have key people involved. So it may not be elites in the societal level of elites, but if you think about strategic choice about those that are key, I mean, it could be students, it could be, sorry?
The civil society.
The civil society, right? I mean, in certain contexts, it may be women who in the official elite aren't necessarily in positions, but are able to influence, So it probably too often is interpreted as elites when it should be key people. Who's key in this strategic context that can transfer that knowledge more quickly than just the kind of drops in the river or the pond or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tamra, again for this fascinating insight into your field of research. And thanks for your contributions and for coming today. And we are looking forward to having a lot of more interesting peace-building lectures. And hopefully maybe sometimes with Tamra again.
Thank you.